ABC Radio
Brisbane and Queensland.
This is ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland.
Hello there, 1:05. My name is Kat Davidson, filling in for Catherine Feeney today and asking you, what are you concentrating on right now? Is it me? Is it the radio? Is it the dishes you're doing, the dog you're walking, the work you're doing? What is your brain most focused on? And do you think that you can focus on more than one thing at once? I roused on Rebecca Livingston this morning because she was making radio so powerful that I was having trouble getting my work done. And I had to turn her down because my brain will only do one thing at once well. Two things badly, three things like I've never done them before. Am I unusual? What does your brain do? Are you one of those people who truly believes that you can do more than one thing at once? You'll find out in moments whether that is actually true.
You're listening to ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland.
If you've ever been listening to the radio or a podcast or anything at all, a song even, and started thinking about something, have you ever done that and realised that you've not heard a word for the last 5 minutes? Happens to me all the time. Or do you work or live with someone who always likes to have noise in the background and it drives you a bit balmy? How can the human brain process more than one thing? And are we all the same in terms of being able to process multiple sources of information? Or are we different? Linda Ray is the CEO of NeuroCapability and specialises in productivity and performance management. Hello there, Linda.
Hello. Lovely to be on your show.
Thank you. Linda, why is it that I can't think when the background noise is too loud, but some of my workmates seem to thrive in it? Do they have better brains?
They might think they have better brains, but that's actually not the case. You'll be happy to hear. Every person is very different in terms of what we can tolerate from a noise background. And I think one of the things that we don't, we assume everyone's like us, like, well, you know, I love having music on when I'm concentrating, but, you know, this person likes absolute silence. So we're very different in our preferences about what supports us to concentrate. And people that have that preference for having some, you know, low-level kind of ambient noise in the background, it's often because they're trying to block out other noises that are vying for their attention. Oh. So that works for some people, but not for others. We know, even if you think about introverts tend to prefer silence, and which is why open-plan offices are quite disastrous for introverts.
Yes.
But also extroverts.
I count myself among that number. You can always tell, like my friends have said, if they want to guess which one of us is home, my husband or I, you can tell by the noise. If it's me, silence. If it's him, blaring music. Yeah,
and I think I've noticed that too in my own relationships. And I mean, I do prefer silence, but that's because I'm also really easily distracted. And I have this thing called bright, shiny object syndrome. I love, you know, I can be distracted incredibly easily, which is very bad for concentrating.
Me too. I get songs in my head that way too, because they just stick in there and I don't even realise they've borrowed their way into my brain. My name is Kat Davidson. Linda Ray is my guest. If you have a question for her, feel free to chime in, 1300 222 612, or maybe you are one of those special people in your brain that you can do two things beautifully at the same time. So you know a bit more about the way the brain works than I do, obviously, Linda. If you're saying you're listening to something and typing on your computer, can you really focus on both at once?
It depends. I guess when you think about just listening to music, that's a relatively low cognitively demanding task, particularly if it's just really quiet background music. But I think one of the really big myths is that people don't understand about the brain is we can't multitask. We can't do two things at the same time. What we're doing instead is we're task switching rapidly between different tasks. And biologically, we can only hold one thing in full attention at any one time, which is, as you were talking earlier about when you're on listening to a podcast and you're doing something else, you'll only take in the parts of the podcast when you're switching your attention fully back to it. But if you then switch it back to, typing out an email, you'll go, oh, what was in that podcast? I can't remember it, because your focus has moved to the email rather than paying full attention on the podcast.
Yes, it's very annoying, because I don't realise that I've tuned out, and I'm like, hang on a second, why are they in San Diego now? What happened? Oh.
That's right. And we do that because we're trying to be more productive. Okay, well, I'll listen to that podcast and at the same time I'll do my email. But in fact, all of the research suggests that actually decreases our productivity. So multitasking doesn't make you more productive. It's quite the opposite effect.
Does that mean, and I'm well aware that my boss is listening, so I'm not asking for me, I'm asking for a friend, that if I'm, he's going to be in here in 10 seconds, if I'm listening to the station meeting, which is very important news, and I'm typing my emails at the same time, is there a chance, Linda, that I'm not actually taking it all in?
Absolutely. And you could miss really key components of important messaging by dividing your attention in that way. And the other thing is, when we constantly divide our attention between tasks, there's actually what's called task switching costs. So it actually makes your brain tireder. So the more that you switch, the more tired that your brain gets, and it actually then makes it harder to concentrate.
Could that be why, and we've got a great call from Steve we're going to take in just a second, but could that be why I'm hearing from a lot of friends who are working from home, they are exhausted by the end of the day, because they are going between, if they're parenting, they've got their children they need to focus on, and then they're working, or they're getting distracted by something at home that usually takes their full attention, and then slipping back into work. And they're getting to the end of the day and not understanding why they are absolutely wiped, although they've not left the house.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of factors at play there. There is what you've just described, all those different ways that we're kind of switching our attention. But for those people that are on Zoom a lot, or on any of those platforms, it's a very different style of concentration. Because we're not actually face to face with that person. So, you're looking at people. You have to keep your attention focused on the camera, and so people, it's certainly with the people I work with, they are talking about, being exhausted at the end of the day. But on the flip side, there's a bunch of other people that have said, this is fantastic. I've been so productive. And it's because they've had less distractions. So, if you're not having children at home that you're having to supervise with learning, and you're on your own, you could find that you've been more productive than at any time in your working life. So there's a bit of a challenge there.
Yes. Linda Ray is my guest. She's the CEO of NeuroCapability. My name is Kat Davidson, and I've asked if you wanted to ask a question of Linda, or you had a comment about your brain, how it works and how you're able to do one or many things at once. Give me a call on 1300 222 612. Steve's at the Gap. G'day, Steve.
Yeah, hi.
Hello. Very well, thank you. Tell me what you do with your tell me about this left-handed, right-handed thing.
I can actually, I'm left-handed, but I cannot use a mouse to save myself with my left hand, so I'm using the mouse with my right hand, so quite often I'm using the mouse with my right hand and scribbling stuff on a post-it note, a notebook with my left hand at the same time, which my colleagues find very amusing.
Actually, because I'm the same. I'm left-handed, but I use the mouse on the right. You're actually doing both at once, or do you stop using the mouse and then write?
No, pretty well at the same time. Most of my colleagues go, "Oh, you're a weirdo." Anyway.
What do you think about that, Linda?
I think that's awesome. I wish I could do that. I'm really jealous.
I'm guessing that's
so when you
is it?
Well, when you think about how we are using a mouse, it's become a habit, so it's habituated in the brain. So it doesn't take very much effort to move the mouse, because you've been doing that presumably for a few years, I'm guessing.
No, it's like a muscle memory, yes.
Yeah, so it becomes, so really, when you're kind of switching between tasks, if you're doing something that's very habituated and is really hardwired in your brain, then you won't have a great deal of difficulty doing those two things. It's when it becomes something that requires thinking, or it's a little bit more cognitively demanding, that's when it becomes a problem.
That's interesting, Steve. Thank you for that. It's a great thing. I can't do that. I'm definitely one thing at a time, or it's all going to get done very badly. I also find, Linda, and I know you're not a psychologist, I should be very careful not to ask you to answer questions that are outside of your scope, but in terms of work setup, which is something you are an expert in, I find I get quite overwhelmed by noise and it makes me grumpy. So I'm trying to be collegiate at home and at work, but it actually makes me feel anxious, which makes me grumpy, which is not a character trait I love about myself, to be honest. Is it something that can be fixed? Can you desensitize yourself to noise, or is it something that you just have to learn to deal with?
I think it's very difficult to desensitize yourself to noise if that's something that is a challenge for you. So what's happening in your brain is you're kind of trying to block out that sound, and that becomes really exhausting over time, and it elevates your stress hormone, cortisol, and so it can actually have negative impacts into the future. So, and I guess that's where things like noise cancelling headphones come in handy, or trying to remove yourself into a quiet space, into, when you've got to do what I call that deep work, that work that requires lots of thinking, it's best done in the environment that suits you. And I think this is one of the things that we don't look at in the workplace enough. We know that when we're doing something that takes lots of concentration and, we're really, really focused on a task, if you get interrupted by a colleague or by a conversation, and we're very prone to noticing conversation, when that happens, it can take 23 minutes to get back into that deep state of thinking. And sometimes we never go back to, that bright idea that we're on the verge of having, and then we hear this conversation, or our email pings, or our phone rings, and we don't go back to that task. So you can imagine, if you add up how many times in a day we're distracted, that's a lot of lost productivity.
Yes, indeed. Here's a great question for you from Jeff. G'day, Jeff.
Hello.
Hello. What did you want to ask?
I wanted to ask if the female brain can multitask more than the male brain, because I've just retired, but I was a teacher, and the male teachers at the staff used to roll their eyes at the female teachers, going, my God, they can do this and that at the same time, while us men couldn't.
I'm so looking forward to this answer.
And I often feel I'm letting the sisterhood down when I share this. So I'm really, really sorry for all the female listeners on listening to the program. The research shows that women are no better at multitasking than men. There you go. I've said it. And I'm very sorry. What women are slightly better at is task switching, but only between tasks that aren't cognitively demanding. So, stirring the... if you think back to, biologically how we have been wired over many, many years, women were able to look after the children while the men went and hunted and do different tasks at the same time. But again, they were not particularly cognitively challenging. It was stuff that they'd done before. So, yeah, unfortunately, women are no better at than men. So there you go.
Great question, Jeff. Thank you very much for that. And Linda Ray, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
She's the CEO of NeuroCapability and specialises in productivity and performance improvement.